Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be looking at a game played between Vishy Anand, the famous 5-time world chess champion from India, and Jan-Krzysztof Duda, the candidate challenger from the great country of Poland. Now, this game was played in the Superbet Rapid and Blitz being held in Warsaw. Before we jump to the game, it's worth noting that this was Vishy's first return to chess in almost 1 year. Now, a lot of people might think that with Vishy having not played for such a long time, perhaps his play would decline. However, Vishy has been on fire in this event, and going into the 6th round game against Jan-Krzysztof Duda, he was on an amazing score of 5 out of 5 with 5 victories. So without further ado, let's jump into this game. So the game starts with e4. We have e6 played by Duda, d4, d5, the French defense, e5, c5, c3, which is the advanced variation. Now Jan plays knight c6 here. We get knight to f3, queen b6, all very standard so far, and now the move a3. White's idea here is to play b4 and challenge the center. So Duda plays c4. We get knight bd2, knight to a5. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that both sides have a connect fort. So black's pawns from e6 to c4 and white's pawns from b2 to e5. However, there is this weakness on b3 with black trying to put a knight there. So Vishy plays rook b1, bishop d7. Now he plays a very interesting move, which is pawn to b4. Now, of course, for those of you guys who are relatively new to chess, a move occurs here which you may not be familiar with, which is pawn takes pawn, also known as en passant. So after pawn takes pawn, we have knight takes b3, and now bishop a4 played by Jan-Krzysztof Duda. Now, this is a very unusual position, and in fact, I haven't looked super closely at the game, so I'm not aware as to whether this was preparation or not, but Vishy plays this move, knight takes a5. Now, you would think that after knight takes a5, you're down material, so why not play a move like knight fd2 to guard the knight? This way you're guarding it with the rook on b1, the knight on d2, and the queen on d1. However, after knight d2, black can play rook c8, putting pressure on the pawn on c3, and now white has an issue. If you play bishop b2, you will lose the knight on b3, and now if you play a move like knight takes a5, for example, black can very simply play queen takes knight, and you're going to lose this pawn on c3, or else you'll lose the queen on d1. So that would have been one way to play, but Vishy plays knight takes a5, bishop takes queen, rook takes queen, and after pawn takes, king, bishop b5 check, important move by the way, king to e7, king takes d1, pawn takes knight on a5. The smoke has cleared here. White has 2 bishops and a knight here. In return, black has a bishop, knight, and a rook. Now, all these pieces are undeveloped, so therefore you would think that white has some compensation. Now, one thing that I will also caution people about is, as most people know, I'm currently deep in preparation for the candidates tournament, which is coming up in Madrid, Spain, in a little less than 1 month. So one thing that's really important to note is that I am working with a supercomputer. I'm using it to train. And if you look at this position with the online engine, the online version of Stockfish, the computer says that in this position, black is better by more than 1 point. It says it's minus 1.13. However, if you're using a Stockfish on a supercomputer, the evaluation is actually close to 0, which is why I was somewhat curious in this game as to whether this was preparation by Vishy or not, because with the weaker computers, even though they're infinitely better than humans, they do not understand this position, whereas the supercomputers immediately say the white has more than enough compensation for the exchange, which he is down here, and he's not even worse. So after b takes a5, we have a4 being played by Vishy. Idea here to maybe go bishop a3, target the king on e7. Additionally, black still has this issue of these 3 pieces, actually all 4 pieces, the rook on a8 as well. They are all underdeveloped. They have not been brought into the game yet. So after a4, f6 is played by Duda. Now again, the computers, the weaker engines, say that after king d8, black is much better, but in reality, this position is equal or slightly better for white even. If black plays king d8, there's this move knight to g5 here. And now after knight to h6, guarding the pawn, white can play the move h4, and after rook to c8, once white plays this move rook h3 with the rook lift, white is better here because, again, black is struggling to develop the pieces. The knight is permanently tied to the pawn on f7. White has ideas like bishop d2 and c4 to target the pawn on a5. White also has ideas like rook to f3, putting maximum pressure on the pawns on f7 and e6 as well. So even if black gets a move like bishop e7 after a move like rook to f3, if you go rook f8, you're always going to lose this pawn on h7. You're also losing this pawn on f7 potentially. So it's very, very difficult to play here. So Duda plays the move f6, and now Vishy plays a fantastic move, which is g4. Absolutely the best move here in the position. Now, the reason this is a very important move is, first of all, you don't want to trade the pawns, because after pawn takes, black will easily be able to develop the bishop and the knight via h6. For example, say, I'll just play a random move like bishop d2. After knight h6, Black has a very simple plan of playing rook g8, activate the rook on the open file, g3. Let's just say knight f7, for example, and after rook e1, Black can even play a move like bishop h6, and now all three of these pieces have been brought into the game, and Black is clearly better. So instead, Vishy plays the move g4 here, which is very restrictive. So for example, say Black plays a move like knight to h6, for example. After knight h6, White can now play this move g5. If you take on g5, White here has a couple options. Probably the best one is to play knight takes pawn, because now you have this very serious threat of bishop a3 targeting the king. Additionally, the pawn on e6 is super weak. So for example, say you play a move like knight f5, I go bishop a3 check. King has no squares on e8 or f7, or even d7 for that matter. So the only square the king can go to is d8, and now there's several ways for White to win, but probably the cleanest is to go knight takes e6 check, creating the fork, king c8, knight takes f8, and now White has a bishop and a knight for the rook, and White is completely winning. So knight h6 is not a great move. Now another attempt here would be to play a move like h5, but now after g5 you have the same problem. If you trade on g5 after knight g5, the same trick with bishop a3 and this big weakness on e6 is simply too much to deal with. Computer gives us this completely winning for White. If you play a move like f5 here, you'll note that the knight is actually completely stuck. It has no squares here. King is in the way, and f6 and h6 are covered. And now after this great move knight h4, Black can already resign the game, because you're threatening to create the fork with knight g6, targeting the king, the bishop, and the rook. If Black plays a move like rook h7, you go g6, target the rook, rook h8, and now you have the very nasty move bishop g5, and this would be checkmate if not for the fact that Black can play knight f6. But even after knight f6, you can simply trade and play a move like bishop f4. You have rook g1, rook e1. Black's king is going to come under attack very quickly, and White is completely winning here. So if you can't go rook h7, the only other try would be a move like king d8 or king f7. If king f7, g6, king e7, bishop g5, we have the same thing. And if Black plays a move like king d8, now you can go knight g6, hitting both the bishop on f8 and the rook on h8. If Black moves the rook, you take the bishop. Black moves the bishop, I guess, you just take the rook, also completely winning. So it's a very tricky position for Black to play. So here Duda plays king f7, trying to bring out the knight or the bishop. So we get g5 being played by Vishy, trying to prevent Black from development. Here if Black plays a move like f5, this actually loses to this move g6, very thematic. Take with a pawn, same issue, knight g5, king e7, bishop a3, king d8, knight e6, king c8, knight f8, same thing, except Black is a pawn on g6 here. And if after g6 Black plays king takes pawn, now you can play the move rook g1 check. If king h5, I think rook g5, king h6, rook f5, king g6, knight h4 would be a very nice checkmate here. And if you go to f7 back, same thing, knight g5. If king e7, bishop a3, of course, king d8, knight e6. And if king g6 here, you can simply play this very nice idea, which is, I believe, is it knight takes or is it bishop d7 first? I think it's actually bishop d7 first, which hits the pawn on e6, and this king is always going to be under attack on g6. Computer says this is winning in many ways. So after g5 is played here, Duda plays h6, trying to invite Vishy to move this pawn on g5 somewhere. Now g6 doesn't work, so after king takes, this g5 square is covered by both pawns, and if you play rook g1, king f7, there's no threat with knight g5, and the king is very safe here. Additionally, after White trades on f6, which happens in the game, you'll notice that even if you take on f6, there's still no square on g5 for the knight, and now the Black pieces are coming into the game. So Vishy plays the move rook g1, inviting Duda to trade on e5, but if Black trades on e5, now after knight takes e5, again White is completely winning, because after king e7, there's knight g6 with the fork, and if Black plays a move like king f6 here, you can go rook g6, king e7, bishop a3 check, king d8, bishop takes bishop, and White again has a bishop and a knight for the rook on h8. So instead, Duda plays the move bishop g7, trying to finish his development with knight e7, trying to bring this rook into the game. Additionally, if White takes on f6, you can take with the bishop and cover the e5 and g5 squares here. So bishop a3 is played. Now we get pawn takes pawn. Vishy takes with the pawn, does not take with the knight. Same reason. After takes, knight e7. Maybe knight e7 is not right. Maybe rook h7 is simpler, bringing the rook into the game here. Black will be able to finish his development eventually. So Vishy takes with the pawn. Again, knight on e7 is still restricted. Can't go to f6 or h6. If you go to e7, after takes, rook g7, White would be winning the game. So we get bishop f8, bishop takes bishop, rook takes, and now Vishy plays knight d4. Now black is still ahead in material, but the problem is white is this great outpost on d4, and additionally this pawn on e6 is very, very weak, and it can be targeted either with bishop d7, putting pressure on the pawn that way, or maybe bishop d3 or bishop e2, trying to push the bishop to either g6, for example, or to h5. So we get h5 being played by Duda. Idea is that now at bishop d7, you have rook h6 to guard the pawn on e6. So we get king e2, rook h6, bishop d7. Again, the idea behind bishop d7 is that if you wait too long and black can go knight e7 and knight f5, or maybe even rook g8, black will be much better, if not winning. So we get bishop d7 being played here, king to e7. Not rook d8, by the way, because after rook d8, there's a very nice tactic here, which is after rook d8, white can go bishop takes pawn, rook takes, and now the beautiful combination, rook g7 check, king takes, knight takes, rook on e6, forking the king on g7 and the rook on d8, and after say king g6, knight d8, white is simply winning. So we get king e7, bishop b5, king d8 here. King f7 would have been a way to make a draw, but Duda wanted to play on. So after king d8, f4 played here. Black cannot take the pawn because then you would lose your knight. So we get knight e7, king e3, h4, h3. Now Duda plays knight f5. We have a trade of the knights, and now rook g7 played, cutting off the king on the back rank, but also trying to win the pawn on b7. Duda plays rook h8 here, trying to activate this rook and stack the rooks on the f file to put pressure on the pawn on f4. Rook takes b7, rook f8 is played, and now we get rook d7, king c8, and now Vishy plays king d4. A great move here, trying to bring the king into the attack. One thing that you learn about endgames is the king can be an active piece, and in many cases can even be can create huge problems for your opponent. So we get rook 8 f7 here, rook d6, rook f4, king c5, rook f3. Now rook e6 is played by Vishy, rook takes c3, and now he goes king d6, and this creates a little bit of a shield here. This pawn on d5 prevents black from ever being able to check on the d file. Also, the bishop on b5 prevents rook d7 here. So now we get d4, rook e8, king b7, e6 played by Vishy, trying to push this pawn up the board. Rook c7, rook d8, not e7 here, by the way, because then black can go rook e3, and now your rook on e8 is stuck, guarding the pawn on e7. So rook d8 is played here. We get d3, Duda trying to use his pass pawn to create counterplay before white can push the e pawn up the board. King e5, d2, rook takes d2, rook takes h3, king d6 played by Vishy, trying again to go e7, e8 and win the game. We get rook e3, rook b2, rook to g7 being played here. Now, important to note that if you move the rook to say c1, for example, there could be problems with say e7 here, or maybe even long-term some idea like bishop e2 followed by e7. Now again, it depends on the exact situation, but there are these tricks. So rook g7 is a way of keeping the rooks where they both guard the pawn, and now if you play bishop d7, I just sidestep with king a7, and again this e7 move is not a threat, and I still have this passed h pawn which I can roll down the board. So we get rook e2 being played here by Vishy. Now this is essentially a draw offer. Perhaps this time both players were low on the clock and Vishy didn't see any way to continue forward and didn't see a way to try and win the game. So we get rook e2, bishop takes, h3, e7, rook g8 being played here, king d7 by Vishy, king b6. Again, you could play h2 first and it would transpose, but either way this is going to lead to a draw. So we get king d7, king b6, queen, trade, king c5, and the players agree to a draw here, quite simply because in this position what would happen is that here white would play bishop f3, black would go king to b4, targeting the pawn on a4, bishop to c6 guarding the pawn, and now after h2 you try to bring the king back. I make a queen, you take, and now I take the pawn, and again very simple draw here, where white ends up sacking the bishop for the a pawn. So a very, very interesting game. Both players probably a chance. It felt like Vishy overall was maybe better prepared, maybe simply had a better feel for what was going on. Obviously he's been having a great tournament. So as we finish up this recap, the one last bit I want to leave you guys with is a couple of things. First of all, I am not surprised at all by Vishy's result. I think he really has nothing on the line. I think he's just playing free. He's enjoying himself. When you look at Duda, there are a couple things. First of all, Duda and several of the other players are playing in the candidates tournament, which is coming up. So they have to sort of avoid showing their main openings. There's this whole sort of psychological game that's going on with every opening choice they make, whether it's a Superbet tournament in Poland, whether it was the previous Grand Chess Tour event in Romania. There are a lot of things going on. Secondly, I feel in the case of Vishy, nobody really knows what they're getting with him. He is somewhat, I would say, semi-retired. He has not been playing much over the border online. I think the last time he played was maybe the Grand Chess Tour event in 2021. So he obviously has not been active, and I think because he hasn't been active, a lot of players are not taking him as seriously as they should be, and he's definitely made many of the players in the Superbet event in Poland pay the ultimate price, and he's having a great event. Very happy for Vishy, and hopefully he's able to bring it home over the next couple of days. Once again, I hope you guys enjoyed this recap. Make sure to hit the subscribe button below, and I will be back with more recaps as we keep moving day by day closer towards the candidates tournament.